Okay, let's see. 736 divided by 8 would be... What the... Anyway, all right, so 8 goes into 72 9 times with a remainder. What in the world is going on out there?
Attention, gas station customers! Don't be a herd of miles per gallon sheep. There's a better way.
Pete, what are you doing? Why are you yelling at the gas station through a megaphone?
Oh, hey, Noah!
Sorry. Hey, Noah.
What's going on here?
Trying to re-educate people on how we should think about fuel efficiency. Can you believe that here in the United States, we still use miles per gallon?
Yeah, so?
Well, that's not the best way to do it. It makes a lot more sense to think about gallons per mile. Well, actually, gallons per 100 miles. That's how European countries have been doing it for years. Of course, they use liters and kilometers, but it's the same idea.
I don't see how this can make any difference at all.
Hello, folks in the blue Camry. Do you have a moment to learn about an important mathematical ratio? MPGs are just a tease. Gallons per mile will make you smile.
Pete, knock it off. First of all, how can gallons per mile be any better of a ratio than miles per gallon? You're comparing the exact same two things, distance and amount of fuel.
Yeah, but the results you get from doing it the way I'm talking about are so much more useful when you're comparing the fuel efficiency of two cars.
That just doesn't make any sense.
Well, you don't have to take my word for it. Popular Mechanics said so too.
Popular Mechanics? You mean like Fonzie or Latka from Taxi?
Dude, no, I mean Popular Mechanics magazine. They did an article explaining why gallons per 100 miles makes more sense. So did Popular Science.
Popular Science? You mean like chemistry and biology?
Again, no. The magazine here too.
Okay. How about we head back inside and you try to explain this crazy idea to me before you get yourself arrested for disturbing the peace?
Sure, but hang on one sec.
I'm going back inside, but the fight rages on. What do we want? What do we want?
Come on, man, help me out here.
What do we want?
Gallons.
How do we want them?
Divided by 100 miles?
That's right.
All right, dude, let's roll.
Get your motor running. Head out on the highway.
Okay, so Noah, before we get into the specifics of working with gallons per 100 miles, I thought it'd be kind of fun to first go through a real world exercise, something that would be familiar to anybody who owns a car, and sort of use that as our baseline for the conversation.
Okay, what did you have in mind?
Well, I was thinking about something that you have mentioned to me many times over the years, which is that you often take a road trip from your house in Northern California down to Southern California to visit family. Like you do that once or twice a year, right?
Yeah, at least once or twice a year.
So I wonder, how much does it cost you to get down to your sister's house? Like if you think about, okay, this is probably the car that we'd be driving in. Here's how much gas is probably going to cost per gallon. I'm interested in knowing how much does it cost to get from your house to their house?
Okay, well, let me tell you how I would start figuring that out. The first thing that I need to know is the distance from my house to my sister's house, and that is just about 400 miles. I'm rounding a little bit, but give or take a few miles, it's 400 miles from my house to her house.
Okay, cool.
And another thing I would need to know is the miles per gallon that my car gets. So we usually take my wife's Subaru when we go on long road trips, and I looked it up right before we started recording. Her car gets 33 miles per gallon on the highway, and this is almost all highway driving down the 5 from Northern California to Southern California. So 400 miles at 33 miles per gallon.
Okay, cool. Actually, those two numbers alone can be used to figure out another important quantity, which is namely how much gas it's going to take you to get down there.
Okay, that makes sense. I can take the 400 miles and divide it by 33 miles per gallon to figure out how many gallons of gas it takes me to get from here to there. And let's see, 400 divided by 33 comes to just about 12 gallons of gas. It's actually 12.1 gallons.
Cool. Well, let's round it down to 12 just to kind of keep things easy to work with. So now you know how many gallons you have to put in your car to get down there. How do we figure out the total cost then?
Well, I would need to know how much gas costs right now. And it just so happens I filled up my car yesterday and I remember what I paid. It was, now for you non-California listeners, be prepared to be shocked. I paid $4.40 a gallon.
Wow. Although isn't that like a lot cheaper than it used to be? Didn't at one point it get up into like 5s and 6s and 7s?
I don't remember it getting into 7s, but it definitely got into the 5s, maybe even the 6s for a while there. But now we are way back down at 440.
To a breezy 440. Okay, so $4.40 a gallon. You need to buy 12 gallons of gas, and that comes to a total of what?
Well, that would be 12 times $4.40, which comes to $52.80. Wow, and that's just one way. It costs me over $100 in gas every time I drive to my sister's and back.
For $187?
Yeah.
Ah! Ah!
They really screw you, don't they?
I think she needs to start driving up here to visit me.
Yeah, I was going to say, it wouldn't kill her to kick in some gas money, you know? Okay, so the first thing you have to do is solve a division problem. You divide the total driving distance by your car's miles per gallon. And if you want to figure out how much it would cost to drive, say, to Seattle, you'd have to solve another division problem, right? One per trip. Now, not that division is super difficult, but it's a little inconvenient. It might be nice to have an easier way,
especially if you're trying to figure this out in your head while you're driving.
Right, which sounds a little dangerous, actually. Well, okay, let's try it a different way. Let's start by calculating how many gallons of gas it takes your car to go 100 miles.
Okay, well, since my car gets 33 miles per gallon, then that means 3 gallons would get me 99 miles. So it's just going to be a hair over 3 gallons. Let's just call it 3 gallons per 100 miles.
Okay, great. Now, let's go back to the question of how much it costs to drive to your sister's house. So if you forget about miles per gallon, set them aside, and instead start from this new ratio, how would you answer the question?
Let's see, wow, it's going to be a lot easier to figure it out this way. If it takes 3 gallons to drive 100 miles, then it takes 4 times that, or 12 gallons to go 400 miles.
And how much would it take to drive to Seattle? Let's say it's 750 miles from your house.
That's easy too. It would be 3 times 7.5, which is 22.5 gallons. Wow, that is a lot easier to do in your head than 750 divided by 33. I see exactly the point you're trying to make here, Pete. It was much easier to start off with the metric gallons per 100 miles and just have to multiply by how many hundreds of miles I want to drive, rather than starting out with miles per gallons and having to do a cumbersome division problem in my head at the beginning of this calculation.
Totally. And once you know how much gas you need, you only have to multiply it by the price per gallon. So to get to Seattle, it would cost you $4.40 times 22.5, which is,
wow, Pete, this is some impressive mental math you got going on here.
Oh, you want to play me like that, huh? Okay, fine. Let's do some rounding. Say $5 per gallon and maybe 20 gallons total. So about $100.
About $100. Alexa, what's $4.40 times 22.5 exactly?
Hi, Noah. $4.40 times 22.5 is exactly $99. Pete, your approximation wasn't too bad.
Thanks, Alexa.
See you guys later.
Is it just me, or is she being nice again? Anyway, besides making calculations simpler, there's another neat thing here. So grouping miles together into groups of 100 actually makes a lot of sense. It lines up pretty naturally with the scale that we think about when driving. So, for example, if you live 15 miles away from work, then you have a daily round trip commute of 30 miles. That means 150 miles per week or 600 miles per month. And these are really natural quantities to look at. So I think groupings of 100 miles at a time is actually a really clever idea. Yeah. Also, I can't help but notice that if we were just going gallons per mile instead of gallons per 100 miles, my car's rating would be 0.03 gallons per mile. And that's just not as friendly of a number as 3. Yeah, you're right. It's not. So I think that's interesting that the units themselves are more human scaled when we think about hundreds of miles at a time. And similarly, the calculation that we have to perform, the numbers there are better suited to that multiple of 100 as well. So that's kind of a nice synergy between those two things.
Muse synergy. Does that sound odd to anyone else? Does that sound like Muse energy?
So I would say first and foremost, thinking in terms of gallons per 100 miles facilitates the kinds of questions we want to ask about our cars, right? And I made a list of typical questions that one would ask about their car, being a car owner, having to buy gas and so forth. Before I share mine, I'm curious, what kinds of questions do you typically ask about your car and its gas mileage?
Well, I know that when I'm shopping for a car and I'm looking at the sticker which says miles per gallon on it, something else that it says is, here's the amount that you can expect to save in a year over a car with average gas mileage. So I guess one thing that people kind of ask is, how much can I expect to spend on gas in a year? Yeah, completely natural question. And again, to answer that question, using gallons per 100 miles is much easier to work with. Let me give you one further example. Last summer, my family went to Tennessee to visit my sister, and we were planning on renting a car, and we had a choice of 2 different models. One of them was a hybrid and one of them wasn't. And each of the 2 cars was listed with its fuel efficiency in terms of miles per gallon. Naturally, the hybrid got better gas mileage, but it was more expensive to rent the hybrid than to rent just an ordinary fuel-based car. The question is, well, which one should we rent? Like, for the time that we're going to be there, which car would save us money? And of course, we thought, well, how many miles are we going to be using this car? And it turned out to be about 700. So again, the units matched up with sort of the scale that we needed to use. Yeah, that makes sense. You know, I've never even heard about gallons per 100 miles until you mentioned it the other day when we were talking about doing an episode about it. I can definitely see, though, how it's useful. Where did you first hear about this?
Well, I also had never heard about or thought about this ratio until a colleague shared an article with me that was written by a couple of professors at Duke University, and they were interested in understanding whether or not people could make better decisions about fuel efficiency and gas consumption and car purchases if they thought in terms of gallons per 100 miles instead of miles per gallon.
And what did they find?
Well, it's interesting. I would say, just as a backdrop, it turns out that in other parts of the world, like let's think about Europe for a second, they naturally frame fuel efficiency in terms of, well, they don't say gallons per 100 miles. They frame it as liters per 100 kilometers. But that's the natural starting point in many European countries. So in the United States, we're sort of an aberration in that sense. And I think what these professors wanted to know was, well, like, how might it benefit us here? And so what they found is that, yeah, people make better decisions if they're thinking in terms of gallons per 100 miles. Cool. So here's an example of the kind of question they asked people. Suppose that you have 2 vehicles. One of them gets 34 miles per gallon and the other gets 18 miles per gallon. And you want to replace one of these 2 cars with something new. And you'd like to know which is the better plan, which would be a better improvement to make. So should you replace your 34 mile per gallon car with one that gets 50 miles per gallon? Or should you upgrade your 18 mile per gallon car to one that gets 28 miles per gallon?
Well, I have not read this article, so let me tell you what my natural intuition would tell me, and then you can tell me how I did. If you upgrade a car that gets 34 miles per gallon to one that gets 50, that's an increase of 16 miles per gallon. Or if you upgrade a car that gets 18 miles a gallon to one that gets 28, that's only an increase of 10 miles per gallon. So I would say the first example is the better one because it's getting you a bigger increase in your mileage.
Exactly. And by that, I mean exactly wrong. This is why this is very deceptive to think about miles per gallon. You're right. A 16 mile per gallon leap seems quite a bit better than a 10 mile per gallon leap, right? It's 60% better.
But what do you mean it seems better? I mean, how is it not obviously better? Just show me the math, Pete.
Right. Well, they did the math, these Duke professors, and they looked at over the course of 10,000 miles of driving, thinking about these two upgrades, which one saves more gas? Okay. So the car that jumps from 34 miles per gallon to 50 ended up saving 94 gallons over the course of 10,000 miles. The car that jumps from 18 mpg to 28 ends up saving 198 gallons, more than twice as much.
What? I hear you, but I need you to talk me through it. How does that work? Why is an increase of 10 miles per gallon better than an increase of 16 miles per gallon?
Okay, let's imagine that we have a bunch of cars, and let's suppose that we have one that gets 10 miles per gallon, one that gets 20 miles per gallon, one that gets 30, 40, 50, and so on. So let's look at how a 10 mile per gallon jump in efficiency from 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, and so on impacts the question of how much gas does it take to drive 100 miles.
All right, let's do it. And let's see if I can start us out. Let's think about this car that gets 10 miles per gallon. So if I take that and flip it around so that instead of looking at miles per gallon, I'm looking at gallons per 100 miles. Well, if I can go 10 miles on a gallon, it's still going to be 10 in this case, isn't it? It's going to be 10 gallons per 100 miles. Am I thinking of this right?
Yeah, you've got it. Yeah.
Okay. Then if we look at 20 miles per gallon, then I'm going to need 5 gallons to go 100 miles. Is that right?
Exactly.
Yep. So jumping from 10 miles per gallon to 20 miles per gallon changed the amount of gas I would need to go 100 miles by 5 gallons. It went from 10 gallons of gas to go 100 miles to 5 gallons of gas to go 100 miles.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point that we should just call out for a second. With miles per gallon, the bigger the number, the more efficient the car is. So 25 miles per gallon is less efficient than 50 miles per gallon, which is less efficient than 100 miles per gallon, right? So bigger is better in this case. When it comes to gallons per 100 miles, where the metric is about consumption of gas, how much gas am I using? There, you want the numbers to go down. So the more efficient the car, the lower that quantity will be. And we're seeing that in the calculation that you just did. 10 gallons for the first car dropped down to 5 gallons for the second car.
Right. Now let's look at the third car. If I get 30 miles per gallon, then I'm going to need 3.3 gallons to go 100 miles. And I can see that that is not the same amount of savings in gallons that we got in the first jump. The first time, going from 10 miles per gallon to 20, we had a savings of 5 gallons. But going from 20 miles per gallon to 30, we're only getting a savings of 1.7 gallons. It's so much smaller. And then I bet you when we go to 40, it's going to be even smaller yet, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. You want to do that for us?
Let's see. If I get 40 miles per gallon, then it's going to take me 2.5 gallons to go 100 miles. Wow, that jump only saved us 0.8 gallons of gas. That's unbelievable. an increase in efficiency of 10 miles per gallon saves you 5 gallons of gas when you go from 10 miles per gallon to 20, but it only saves you 0.8 gallons of gas when you go from 30 to 40. It seems like the more fuel efficient the car is to begin with, the less the savings are going to be when you give it a little bit of an upgrade.
That's exactly right. And I think that's a super important message for folks to understand, right? We spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, my car gets 35 miles per gallon, but how can I get it up to 47? Or could I possibly reach 50? All well and good. Those are important things to think about. But collectively, if we could improve gas mileage on the bottom end of the spectrum, we would be far better off. We would be able to reduce gas consumption at a much larger scale if we could improve those cars that are on the road today getting 10 miles per gallon.
Yeah, I definitely see that. And I'm kind of picturing like maybe a limousine business or a taxi cab company that has a whole fleet of cars, and maybe they have some money to upgrade some of their cars. When you look at it this way, it's so much more obvious which ones they should be upgrading. They should be upgrading the ones that get the worst gas mileage. Even if they could get a bigger increase in miles per gallon by upgrading the ones that are already getting better mileage, in the long run, it's going to save them in gas costs to bump up the ones that are getting the worst mileage.
Exactly. And you couched it in terms of, let's say, a company that has a fleet of vehicles, or like the government, which also has lots and lots of vehicles, right? But this same argument applies to families or even individuals that have cars. My family happens to have 2 cars, and one of them gets better gas mileage than the other. And so if we were thinking about upgrading one of our 2 cars, if we're interested in reducing our fuel consumption and also reducing, therefore, how much we spend on gas, we really should look at the car that is on the lower end, the one that is not already getting pretty good gas mileage. And so, I think that's an interesting learning for anybody that is interested in these kinds of questions.
Yeah, I can see that now. The way you just led me through that really opened my eyes. This is a much better way to look at it.
Something I've been thinking about since I first heard about this gallons per 100 miles is, if it is clearly better, and it's not even that big a deal, like you flip the ratio and you multiply by 100, that's not asking all that much. Why do you think we haven't switched over to the better system yet? Like, why aren't we all doing this? It just seems so obvious.
Yeah, but I think if you think about it for just a second, it's the same reason that they've been telling us since we were in first grade that we're switching over to the metric system any day now. And here we are in our 50s, and it still hasn't happened. There is so much societal inertia just keeping us right here doing it this old way that's not as good.
Oh my goodness. It's been like 40 years that we're waiting just a minute because it's about to happen.
Almost there.
This makes me think that maybe the right question to ask isn't which is the better system, because then we'll just go do the better one. It makes me think that the right question to ask is, what is it going to take to overcome the inertia around using the old system? How can we make the kinds of changes necessary so that school systems and government agencies and even just individual consumers start to prefer using this other better system? And I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, because the problem, Pete, is that even if the new way is clearly better, it's not going to be as comfortable for a little while people are learning the new way. And if they are comfortable with something that they're doing now, even if it's worse, they don't want to deal with that learning curve. They don't want to make it a little bit more difficult, even if it's just for a little while en route to making it a lot simpler. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And, this is making me think of the summer that I spent in Spain shortly after graduating from college. Everywhere I went, the temperature was posted on these signs in terms of Celsius.
The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain.
By George, he's got it. By George, he's got it.
And, I had to remind myself, okay, what does 25 degrees Celsius mean? And I would perform the calculation, and then I would go, oh, it's in the mid 70s. Oh, okay. That's great. And I did that for probably 6 weeks. And then eventually it got to the point where I would look at the thermometer and say 32 Celsius. Yeah, that's hot. Just because I knew what 32 Celsius felt like. I had internalized it and I no longer had to do the calculation, right? I think we would get there too with gallons per 100 miles. Yeah. Yeah. I have a friend named Oliver and we walk our dogs together most mornings, and he moved here from France. And when we were getting ready to do this episode, I mentioned it to him and he said back, yeah, when I moved to the United States, I didn't understand why this is the way that people look at gas mileage here, why they do miles per gallon instead of gallons per 100 miles. He says it didn't make sense. And I found myself constantly doing the conversion in my head to make it make more sense to me. I think he still prefers to convert it to gallons per 100 miles when he's doing it in his head. Yeah, I think we all need to get there, to be honest. You know, when I first heard about this ratio, this idea of we should use gallons per 100 miles instead, my immediate reaction, and I'll admit, I'll throw myself under the bus here. My immediate reaction was big whoop, like nothing burger. Okay, it's the same. It's not hard to convert between them. You know, and that's the mathematician in me is like, well, look, it's just an invertible function that takes you back and forth. It's not about the mathematics. It's not, look at the interesting math here. What it's about is the application of the mathematics and how the mathematics can empower you to make better decisions. You can think now about reducing your fuel usage more easily because of this formula, right? And I think that's a good thing. Yeah. And something I found out when we were researching this is for the last 10 years, they have been putting gas mileage on the window stickers of cars at car dealerships with both miles per gallon and gallons per 100 miles. But here's the interesting thing I noticed, Pete. If miles per gallon is written in 100-point font, gallons per 100 miles is written in about a 25-point font. It's about a quarter as big and kind of tucked there underneath, so you hardly even see it. It's like, throw me a bone, why don't you? Okay, well, at least that information is there. You know, I think here is kind of like the bottom line for me about this ratio. Miles per gallon is framed in terms of the outputs. It measures the benefit that the car owner receives from their particular car. How many miles per gallon do I get? Oh, I can go so many miles on a single tank of gas. It's all about the output, the benefit. When we switch to gallons per 100 miles, it's framed in terms of inputs, right? It measures the amount of gas that a vehicle consumes. In other words, how much gas do I need to use to drive a certain distance? And we know that fossil fuels are a finite resource on the planet. We know that it's getting harder and harder to extract fuel from the planet. And so I think a conceptual framework that turns this around and gets people thinking about consumption rather than benefit is part of, you know, addressing the environmental concerns that collectively we're facing. Well, I thought when we started this conversation that it was going to be a very hard fight for you to convince me that gallons per 100 miles is better in any way than miles per gallon. But I think now I could definitely say I know at least 2 ways that it's better. So well done, Pete. You totally converted me. Before we finish here, do you want to tell our listeners how they can reach out to us if they have questions or comments about the show that they'd like to make? Absolutely. I would love to hear from everybody calling in to tell me how many gallons per 100 miles their cars use. So leave us a voice message on our SpeakPipe page. The address is speakpipe.com/mathclubpodcast. Or you can write us a message, send us a tweet. Our handle is @mathclubpodcast. And of course, as always, you can email us directly. Our address is mathclubpodcast@gmail.com. Awesome. And speaking of reaching out, we are still collecting your favorite math jokes for an upcoming episode. We'd like to do all about math humor and math jokes. So please send those our way. Pete, I got to get going because I have a task I need to take care of. Now that I know how much better it is to flip these ratios around, I'm going to convert my salary from
dollars I make per year to how many minutes I have to work to earn 42 nickels.
All right. Well, if you need any help doing that, give me a call.
All right. Bye, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.